Kansas, in the year 1872, what would you do if a girl, barely 17, was marked for death because of her father's name? Would you stand by her side when bounty hunters circled Dodge City at night? Or turn away, like the townsfolk who feared the cold blood? This is not just a Western tale, it's a story of a promise that refuses to die. Stay to the end, because what happens will change how you see courage forever. And tell me, what would you have done in her place? Welcome to WestDream Tales, where the Wild West comes alive through untold stories of courage, love, and survival. Subscribe now, so you never miss the legends, the betrayals, and the promises that still echo across the frontier. The summer heat lingered long past sundown in Dodge City, Kansas. The saloons had gone quiet, shutters drawn tight against the restless wind. Inside a weathered wooden shack at the edge of town, Ethan Cole lay on a narrow bed, his breath shallow, his shirt darkened by the dust and the fight he had barely survived. Beside him knelt Clara, 17 years old, her fingers trembling as she pressed a damp cloth against his side. The lamplight flickered across her face, revealing a girl caught between childhood and the weight of a world she never asked for. Ethan reached for her wrist, his grip weak but steady, the hand of a man who had never begged anyone for mercy until now. His voice was gravel and shadow. "Clara, listen. I won't leave you alone. Not ever." His eyes, once steel gray and unshakable, now softened as they met hers. She leaned closer, her cheek brushing his rough hand. The intimacy of father and daughter bound by fear of the coming dark. A storm gathered outside. Thunder rolled low across the plains, shaking the shutters loose. Every gust seemed to whisper of unfinished debts. Clara closed her eyes as his chest rose and fell with painful irregularity. Then, with a final exhale, Ethan Cole's body grew still, the weight of his promise lingering in the heavy silence. Clara did not weep. Her tears had been spent long ago, watching her father walk into gunfights and stagger home broken. She sat with him through the night, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, as though the contact alone could keep him tethered to the earth. But Dodge City did not wait long to smell weakness. Word spread by dawn. Ethan Cole was gone. In the tavern, men muttered, "The legend's dead. His girl won't last a week." In the stable yard, a woman spat in the dirt. "Blood calls to blood. She'll end up no different." Lie do, in seeding off his tooth. As shadows lengthened that evening, hoofbeats thundered across the prairie. A half-dozen riders crested the ridge, dust trailing behind them like a storm front. At their head was Ralph Kane, scarred jaw set hard, his eyes burning with the memory of a humiliation he had carried since Wichita. They came not for coin alone but for revenge, and perhaps to watch the last ember of the Cole name snuffed out. The bounty pinned to Ethan's head still glimmered in their pockets, but Kane wanted more. He wanted the satisfaction of breaking the daughter where he had failed to break the father. Clara sat by the cold hearth when she heard the riders draw near. She rose slowly, every muscle stiff with dread. Her gaze fell to the Colt revolver lying on the table, its silver grip dulled by years of use, the same weapon that had carved her father's legend into the plains. Her hands shook as she reached for it. For a moment she saw her own reflection in the metal, a pale ghost staring back. She wrapped her fingers around the grip, whispering words she barely understood. Not alone. Never alone. The riders dismounted outside, spurs clinking, boots crunching on the porch boards. Ralph Kane's voice cut through the night, smooth and mocking. "Come on out, little dove. We're not here for you, just what your daddy left behind." "It is a roops." Clara pressed her back against the door, her heart pounding so loud she thought they would hear it. Her father's promise echoed in her chest, not as comfort, but as command. She steadied her breath, lifted the revolver, and stepped into the glow of the lamplight. The men expected a girl to crumble. Instead, they saw the steel of Ethan Cole's gaze alive in her hazel eyes. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the porch. Then thunder cracked overhead, rattling the sky. The storm had come. Clara's finger brushed the trigger. Kane's smile faltered, and in that charged stillness, the promise of a dead man was about to speak again, louder than any gunshot Dodge City had ever heard. The story of Ethan Cole stretched across the plains like a shadow that never lifted. Long before Dodge City whispered his name, he had carved his reputation in the dust and fire of Santa Fe. In the summer of 1867, when outlaws disguised as Apache raiders descended on a caravan, It was Ethan who rode straight into the gun smoke and left the ground littered with spent shells and broken ambition. The survivors remembered his stance more than the gunfire. Wide-brimmed hat tipped low, revolver steady, and eyes that seemed carved from stone. He was 25 then, young enough to believe the iron in his hand could bend fate, but already weathered by too many nights beneath an open sky. The newspapers called him a hero. The men he faced called him something worse. Glory came fast, but it burned hotter than Ethan could hold. By the fall of 1870, the legend had spread from Kansas to New Mexico. Every saloon carried tales of the man who never missed, the gunfighter who faced impossible odds. Yet behind the bravado was a man losing more than he gained. His wife, Mary, grew tired of the silence he carried home. Silence that smelled of whiskey and gunpowder. Their daughter Clara was 5 when the raid happened near Cimarron. Ethan had been gone for weeks, chasing the trail of a gang who mocked his name in letters pinned to telegraph poles. Mary stayed behind with Clara, waiting, hoping the stories of her husband's invincibility were true. But that night, flames swallowed the small homestead, and Mary's body was never found among the ruins. Clara remembered the smoke more than the screams. She remembered clutching her father's coat as he rode back too late, his face drained of everything except the realization that his enemies had taken more than victory from him. From that night on, the Cole house was a hollow place, filled only with the weight of what was gone. Ethan raised his daughter as best as a man marked by vengeance could. He taught her to ride horses across the plains, to track footprints along the creek beds, and to listen for the silence that comes before danger. He never spoke much of Mary, but Clara saw her mother's likeness in every broken smile he gave. In quiet moments, when she rested her head against his shoulder by the fire, she felt the warmth of a man still trying to be father and protector, even as darkness gnawed at the edges of his soul. But Dodge City never forgave easily. Children whispered behind Clara's back, calling her the Gunslinger's girl. Shopkeepers watched Ethan with suspicion, waiting for the next fight to spill through their doors. Even the preacher who once praised Ethan for his courage now avoided his eyes on Sunday mornings. Legends were entertaining in stories, but terrifying when they lived next door. Ethan carried the burden without complaint. He drank more, slept less, and his temper frayed like a rope left too long in the rain. Clara learned to read the mood of her father's silence. She knew when to stay close and when to give him space. And in those nights when he would stumble in, wounded or bruised, she would sit by him, pressing cloth to his injuries, whispering that he was still the strongest man alive. Her hand against his arm, her cheek resting lightly against him, small anchors that kept him from drifting into the void. By 1871, the name Ethan Cole had begun to shift. No longer just a hero of dime novels, he was whispered as a threat to the powerful. Ranchers with too much land and too little mercy feared his presence. Politicians cursed his interference when he stood against unjust taxes and crooked sheriffs. His enemies multiplied, and so did the men who carried his likeness in wanted posters. It was in Wichita that Ralph Kane first crossed paths with Ethan. Kane was loud, brash, eager to prove himself with a pistol. Their duel should have ended in blood, but Ethan had humiliated him instead, shooting the revolver clean out of his hand in front of half the town. Kane carried that scar not on his skin but in his pride, and he swore he would make the Cole family pay. Clara never forgot that day. She was standing on the boardwalk, clutching her father's sleeve, when the crowd roared with laughter at Kane's defeat. Ethan had rested his hand briefly on her shoulder, steady and protective. That single touch told her everything, that no matter the enemies he made, his strength was for her. But strength could not silence the whispers. As Clara grew older, the weight of her surname pressed harder. At 15, when she walked through Dodge City's market, mothers pulled their children close. At 16, young men dared not court her, fearing the shadow of her father's revolver. She was alone, except for the man who had given her both a burden and a shield. And yet, in the privacy of their home, there were moments of gentleness that few would believe. Ethan teaching her to string a guitar he barely knew how to play. Clara brushing the dust from his coat as he dozed by the fire. Their bond was stitched together by the ordinary gestures that kept them human. He would place a rough hand over hers, not as a gunslinger, but as a father, trying to remind her that she was more than his shadow. The years carried them closer to the edge. Ethan's enemies circled tighter, drawn by the bounty and the desire to end the myth. Clara could see it in the way strangers watched them at the saloon door, in the way letters arrived without sender names, warning of what was coming. And always, at the center of that storm, was Ralph Kane, patient as a wolf, waiting for blood. The twist came quietly, almost hidden in an ordinary night. Clara had gone to fetch water from the well when she saw a shape lingering near the corral. A shadow moved, then vanished. She told her father, but Ethan only nodded, as if he already knew. His hand brushed her shoulder, heavy but reassuring. "Stay close, Clara," he murmured, the faintest trace of fear beneath his calm. It was the first time she realized the legend could be afraid. The first time she saw him not as untouchable, but as a man haunted by ghosts he could not outrun. The following weeks carried them toward the night of his death. Every gesture between them grew heavier, his hand resting on her hair a little longer, her arm looped through his as they walked home. The intimacy was quiet, unspoken, yet filled with urgency. It was as if Ethan knew his promise would soon be tested in ways Clara could not yet imagine. And when the storm finally came to Dodge City, with riders cresting the ridge and Kane at their head, Clara would carry all those echoes, the lessons, the touch, the silent vows into the moment where her trembling hand closed around the revolver and her father's shadow rose to stand beside her once more. Spring crept across the plains in 1872, but Dodge City felt no renewal. The streets carried the unease of a place where ghosts lingered, and every shuttered window seemed to hide a whisper. Clara Cole moved among them with her father's shadow clinging to her like a second skin. The townsfolk had long since traded awe for suspicion. Men leaned on posts, muttering as she passed. Women pulled their children close, warning them in hushed tones. "She won't last," they said. "The cold blood will consume her." The words followed Clara home, sharp as spurs against stone. Her small shack stood at the edge of town, the boards weathered gray by wind and time. Inside, the revolver lay wrapped in cloth beneath her shawl. Some nights, Clara placed it on the table and watched the flame of the lamp flicker across its silver grip. Her fingers hovered over the metal, trembling between fear and defiance. When Kane returned, he did not ride alone. 3 men flanked him, their horses kicking dust along Front Street. They did not shoot. They planted a new bounty sheet on the saloon wall. Ethan Cole's name crossed in red, and beneath it, hers. The town gathered, their silence heavier than the ink. Clara found the paper the next morning outside the general store. She tore it free, the edges ripping under her grip. Folding it tight, she pressed it against her chest before slipping it into her pocket. For the first time, her hands shook in full view of Dodge City, and still she did not look away. By dusk, whispers spread like prairie fire. Some said she was marked for death. Others said she would bring ruin to every home. Clara returned to find their shack ransacked, trunk pried open, clothes scattered, boots missing. On the floor, her mother's locket glinted, dented but whole. She picked it up, her breath shallow, pressing it to her chest until her heartbeat steadied against it. That night, the storm broke. Rain lashed against the roof as Clara sat at the hearth, the revolver across her lap, the locket pressed to her lips. "I can't do this," she whispered to no one. But the silence answered with memory, the warmth of her father's hand guiding hers, the scent of smoke and leather when he carried her as a child. She closed her eyes, letting those fragments root her in place. Kane was patient. He circled Dodge City like a wolf, testing the fences. Clara saw them in glimpses, riders cresting the ridge, shadows near the corral, eyes in the dark. Each time she told herself it was nothing. Each time her body betrayed her with a shiver. One evening, as she carried water from the well, a boy no older than 10 stepped into her path. His hands shook as he held out a folded scrap. "They told me to give you this." Clara bent, her fingers brushing his as she took the note. By the time she looked up, the boy had vanished into the dark. The words were hurried, ink bleeding in the damp. "The Cole name dies tonight." Clara read them again and again, her pulse racing, until the letters blurred under the rain. She tucked the note into her pocket, beside the bounty sheet, the 2 papers burning against her like brands. That night she did not sleep. She waited, revolver steady in her hand, back pressed against the wall. The locket rested warm against her skin, its chain biting faintly into her collarbone. Every creak of the boards, every howl of the wind, drew her finger closer to the trigger. Close to midnight, boots sounded on the porch. Slow, deliberate. The latch lifted, and the door swung wide. Ralph Kane stepped in, lantern light spilling over the scar that split his jaw. Two men followed, their faces shadowed, their hands resting easy on holstered guns. Clara rose, the revolver heavy in her grip. Kane's smile was thin. "Your daddy made me a fool once. I won't let his ghost do it again." His gaze flicked to her hands. "Go on then, prove you're his blood." Her throat tightened. The revolver shook, her knees unsteady. Kane stepped closer, the lantern throwing his shadow long across the floor. "That's what I thought," he mocked. "Just a girl." But the locket pressed harder against her skin, sharp as truth. Clara remembered her father's voice, steady in her ear. "Never run from silence. Face it." Her breath slowed. The revolver steadied. The room narrowed. The storm outside dulled to a roar. Clara lifted the gun higher, her hazel eyes locked on Kane's. Something flickered in his smirk. The men behind him shifted, uneasy. For the first time, it was not Kane, but Clara who held the silence. The lantern guttered. In the heartbeat of shadow, Clara fired. The bullet struck the wall beside Kane, splinters flying. The echo rang through the shack, then died. No one moved. Clara's arm stayed firm, her gaze unbroken. She had not missed by accident. Kane read it in her eyes. The shot was a warning, not weakness. For a long moment he stood there, teeth clenched, scar whitening. Then he spat on the floor, turning sharply. "Not tonight." His men followed, boots pounding across the porch. The door slammed, leaving Clara in the lantern's glow, her chest heaving. Her arms trembled as she lowered the revolver. She pressed the locket to her lips, her eyes burning. The storm howled on, but inside, something steadier than fear had taken root. By morning, the town knew. Some called her reckless, others called her brave, but all had seen what Kane himself could not break: the promise of Ethan Cole, carried not by a dead man's gun, but by the unshaken will of his daughter. The summer dusk stretched long and heavy, painting the plains in copper and shadow. Clara Cole stood at the doorway of her shack, watching the horizon burn with the last light. The air was too still, the silence too sharp, like the moment before a trigger is pulled. All day, riders had been spotted moving along the ridges, circling the town like vultures. Dodge City tried to look away, but no one truly slept. Mothers drew their curtains. Fathers sat with rifles across their knees. Everyone knew Kane would come again. Everyone knew the final reckoning had arrived. Clara laid her hand on the revolver at her hip, the weight no longer unfamiliar. Her thumb traced the worn silver grip, the same touch her father once made when steadying her small hands years ago. That memory flickered warm against the chill of the night. By moonrise, the thunder of hooves broke across the prairie. Dust rose like smoke as Ralph Kane and his men crested the southern ridge. This time, there were more, nearly a dozen riders. Rifles strapped, faces hardened by hunger for coin and blood. Their silhouettes looked like storm clouds riding the earth. Clara stepped into the yard, lantern light falling over her shoulders. Her braid loosened in the wind, strands of chestnut hair across her face. She placed one hand against the doorframe, grounding herself, before walking forward into the open. Kane pulled his horse to a halt, the beast pawing at the dirt. His voice carried, sharp and mocking. "The Cole name ends tonight. You can hand it over, girl, or we can take it." The men behind him jeered, the sound cutting through the night air. Clara's heart pounded, but her stance did not break. She remembered her father's last words, the warmth of his palm against her cheek. She drew the revolver slowly, raising it to chest height. The lamplight caught the barrel, turning it into a shard of silver. The men laughed, but Kane's eyes narrowed. He had seen that look before, the calm before Ethan Cole fired. Now it burned in his daughter's gaze, not flawless, but fierce. "You think one bullet will stop us?" he sneered. Clara did not answer. Her breath steadied, shoulders square. For a moment, the whole world hushed, the prairie wind holding its breath. Then, without warning, the first shot cracked, not from her gun, but from the darkness of the ridge. A man in Kane's line pitched backward, rifle slipping from his grasp. The riders shouted, whirling to find the source. Another shot rang out, clean and sharp, scattering them like startled cattle. Kane cursed, spinning in his saddle. Clara stood frozen, the revolver still raised. She did not know who had fired, only that shadows on the ridge moved with purpose. And then she realized her father had not only left her a promise, he had left allies, silent debts repaid in the hour of need. Cain snarled, jerking his horse forward. "Enough games!" He spurred toward her, revolver drawn. Clara's knees threatened to buckle, but she lifted her weapon. Their eyes locked his with rage. Hers was something steadier, anchored by memory and fire. The world seemed to narrow into that line between them. Cain fired. The bullet split the air, grazing the wood of the doorframe behind her. Clara squeezed the trigger, her shot striking true, splintering the lantern at Cain's side, fire spilling across his coat. The horse reared, screaming. Cain fought to steady it, flames licking his sleeve. He flung himself free, rolling hard into the dirt. His men wavered, torn between charging and fleeing, the unseen rifles still cracking from the ridge. Clara stepped forward, revolver steady. Her breath came sharp, but her eyes never wavered. The locket at her throat glinted as she spoke, her voice louder than she expected. "It ends here, Cain." He rose, coat smoldering, face twisted in fury. "You're no legend," he spat. "You're just a scared little girl. It made pretty and a groft in the other falm." Clara's grip tightened, her finger brushing the trigger. "Maybe," she said, her voice trembling yet unbroken. "But I'm my father's daughter." The standoff stretched, every heartbeat louder than thunder. Then the riders began to fall back, spooked by the unseen shots and the fire in her stance. Cain cursed, retreating step by step until only his shadow lingered. With a final glare, he mounted a riderless horse and vanished into the night. Silence swept the prairie, broken only by the wind through the grass. Clara lowered the revolver, her arms trembling, tears streaking her face. She pressed the locket to her lips, the warmth of metal grounding her in the hollow that followed. Behind her, the townsfolk had gathered quietly, drawn by the gunfire. None had lifted a hand to help, yet all had seen. They watched Clara Cole, hair loose in the wind, revolver still warm, standing where Ethan once had. For the first time, Dodge City did not whisper. It bowed its head in silence. Clara turned, meeting their eyes. There was no triumph in her face, only the weight of what had passed. Her gaze softened when she saw a young girl clutching her mother's skirts, staring up with wide, unblinking eyes. Clara knelt, resting a hand lightly on the child's shoulder, the gesture gentle and grounding. The night held its breath, and in that fragile stillness, the promise of Ethan Cole lived on, not in gunfire, not in fear, but in the steady touch of his daughter, who had faced the storm and remained standing. The prairie lay quiet after the storm, its grasses bent from the night's fury. Clara Cole stood in the pale dawn light, her revolver lowered, smoke still clinging to the barrel. The air carried the scent of rain and gunpowder, a mixture that felt carved into her lungs. Behind her, Dodge City's people lingered at the edge of the yard. They said nothing. They only watched as the girl who had faced Ralph Cain's wrath wiped the soot from her cheek and steadied her breath. For once, no whispers followed her, only silence, heavy and new. Clara turned toward the shack. Inside, the lantern burned low, casting shadows across the walls her father once leaned against. She touched the doorframe with her fingertips, remembering the bullet that had split the wood inches from her body. Her hand lingered there, as if the grain of the timber could still hold his presence. By mid-morning, the townsfolk drifted away, leaving only a few behind. An old rancher tipped his hat, muttering, "Stronger than her father." Yet another voice answered from the crowd, "Sharper, or worse, blood makes beasts." The words struck, but Clara did not falter. She knelt by the small grave where Ethan Cole rested, earth still fresh from spring rains. Kneeling, she laid the silver revolver on the mound, the metal catching the rising Sunday. "You can rest now," she whispered, her palm pressed lightly against the soil. "I'll carry the name but not the blood." The locket glinted at her throat. She held it between her fingers, pressing it gently against her lips. For a moment, it felt like both parents breathed there with her, her mother's warmth, her father's weight. The intimacy was quiet, unspoken, yet it steadied her. Weeks passed, and Dodge City shifted. Shopkeepers greeted her with nods instead of stares. Children no longer whispered when she crossed the street, yet trust did not come freely. At the saloon, men still muttered, wagering whether she would follow her father's path or carve her own. Clara worked the land her father left behind. She mended fences, rode out across the prairie, and carried water from the well. The revolver stayed locked in a chest, untouched, while her hands found purpose in soil instead of steel. Still, she kept the locket close, pressing it in moments when fear crept at the edges of her resolve. But the shadows of Cain did not vanish. Riders were seen along the ridges, sometimes at dusk, sometimes at dawn. They never approached, never fired, but they watched. Clara felt it each time, the prickle at her spine, the weight of eyes she could not meet. One evening, as she walked back from the well, she found a folded scrap wedged in the doorframe. The ink was smudged, but the words clear. "Will return when silence falls." Her chest tightened. She crushed the note in her fist, her breath sharp against the dark. That night she sat by the hearth, the revolver laid out once more. Her fingers brushed the barrel, the metal cold and certain. She thought of her father's last promise, the storm she had survived, the child in the crowd who had looked up at her with unblinking eyes. Clara closed her hand around the revolver, then set it aside. She would face what came, but not let it claim her soul. The twist came quietly. At dawn, she stepped outside to find hoof prints circling the yard, fresh, pressed deep into the mud. Whoever had left them had been close enough to touch the walls, close enough to hear her breathing inside. Clara bent down, her hand brushing the damp earth, and felt a shiver run through her. She rose slowly, her eyes tracing the horizon. The prairie stretched wide and endless, but for the first time, she understood the truth. Cain might be gone, but shadows like his never truly died. They waited, patient, for silence to fall. Clara's hand found the locket at her throat. She pressed it firmly, steadying herself. The dawn wind tugged at her braid, lifting strands of chestnut hair. She stood tall, her gaze unflinching. The town would remember Ethan Cole for his gun. They would remember Clara Cole for the night she stood against death and did not break. Yet only she knew the deeper promise that legends end. But what they leave behind must be lived, not feared. With the prairie wind around her, Clara turned from the yard, her steps carrying her toward the open land. Behind her, Dodge City stirred awake. Before her, the horizon waited, endless and unyielding. And in that stillness, her father's voice seemed to ride the wind, quiet, steady, eternal, never alone, never afraid. Clara placed her hand gently against her chest and kept walking, carrying the ashes of a promise into the wide and waiting world. You've just heard another tale from the Wild West, brought to life by WestDream Tales. If the story moved you, hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more. The frontier is full of secrets, and the next one might change how you see history forever.